Hello, everyone. My name is Yvonne Samuels, and today I will be going over the theoretical framework of intersectionality. So, before I dive into what intersectionality is, I wanted to quickly define what theoretical framework means. And so we can do this by dividing theory and framework. So, theory is an idea or ideas formulated to explain, predict, and understand, challenge, or extend knowledge. Framework is a basic structure underlying a system, concept, or text. So, the definition of a theoretical framework is a pre established theory that can hold or support research, which is used for numerous studies. So, you can see these kind of lectures and assignments over theoretical frameworks within critical theory courses, cultural studies courses, many subfields of English courses, and many other courses. You can use it for research, argumentative papers, presentations, anything to do to define certain kind of theoretical frameworks. So this the so for this presentation, for this presentation, I will be going over the definition of intersectionality. I will give a quick background of the framework, the value of this framework, and a few points and examples given by Kimberle Crenshaw from her article, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. And I will also be including an example of the Anita Hill case for this presentation. So what is intersectionality? So the definition of intersectionality is the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and relating systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination against gender, class, race, disability, and so on. In Kimberle Crenshaw's article, Mapping the Margins, she defines and gives an example of intersectionality by stating the intersection of racism and sexism factors into Black women's lives in ways that cannot be captured wholly by looking at the race or gender dimensions of those experiences separately. So, what does that mean exactly? So, that means that intersectionality proves that people do not fit into just one box, that every person has multiple identities and face multiple forms of inequalities and disadvantages, which should not be ignored or separated. So, for example, I'm a Hispanic woman. So both my gender and my ethnicity are part of my identity, and my identities cannot be separated. For that reason, the intersection of me being both a woman and Hispanic should not be ignored or marginalized in any way. So, a quick history and background of intersectionality. The idea of this theoretical framework has begun around since the time of the abolitionist movement of 1830s. Now, during this time, there was no concept or theory or a theory of intersectionality, but you could hear the conversation or discussions of this during this time. Obviously, during the abolitionist movement in the 1830s, they were focusing on ending slavery and racism, but a lot of Black women, felt that they were only focusing on Black men and the tragedies and the issues, that the violence that they were dealing with, and excluding the sexual violence and violence towards Black women. And so many women, such as Sojourner Truth, believe that the issues of sexism should not have been excluded as they fought against slavery and racism. Truth and other Black women spoke up about the power struggles of both racism and sexism, and they felt excluded from Black men and white women. Because at this time, also white women were making movements and discussing feminist issues, but again, Black women felt excluded because of their race. But in throughout the 1960s and 70s, many theorists created frameworks discussing the overlapping of identities and oppression. But it wasn't until 1989 when Kimberle Crenshaw, a law professor, coined the term intersectionality and wrote numerous articles on the framework. And still to this day, she gives a lot of TED Talks and presentations and other articles discussing intersectionality. But the article that I'm going to be using for this presentation is Mapping the Margins, that she wrote in 1991. So what is the value of this framework? So it demonstrates how identities cannot be separated, which means that the multiple layers of oppression cannot be separated as well. The oppression cannot be reduced to only one part of a person's identity. So, for example, an undocumented woman in the US cannot separate the power struggles and discrimination or oppression of being both undocumented and a woman. So she cannot separate her gender from her race and vice versa. So let's say that that undocumented woman in the United States is being sexually harassed. She would not report it to the police because of her fear of being deported or taken into custody. Therefore, her identity of being undocumented affects the fact that her gender is being violated and discriminated. The system put in place that promises to protect all women from sexual harassment or sexual violence is then inferior. So by valuing the intersection of a person, such as an undocumented woman or a woman of color, will help stop marginalizing individuals such as women of color or issues such as sexual violence against women. So like I said, I'm going to be quickly discussing only three certain points from three certain examples that Kimberle Crenshaw discusses in her article. Her article discusses, I would recommend reading this article. In fact, if I were to do the whole article, that would be a whole separate video on itself, because she does a great job of dissecting and showing you all the different ways of how ignoring intersectionality marginalizes violence against women of color. And she also discusses identity politics and all of that. But I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to be going over everything, but she does divide intersectionality into three main categories. And so she discusses structural intersectionality, which is, as the way that she describes it, is as the oppression of women of color dealing with the intersecting of race and gender creates experiences of sexual violence different from white women. And I will be discussing two of those points from there. Political intersectionality, she discusses how the political systems that are created to help women of color have instead marginalized sexual violence against women of color. And I'll be quickly discussing just one point from that one. And she also, in her article, discusses representational intersectionality, which she's discussing the disempowerment of how women of color are represented within popular culture. And I'm not going to be diving into that. So for the first point, one of the points that she discusses of structural intersectionality is that the structural intersectionality and battering that many women of color face. So shelters that are created to help abused women will also have to help them with other forms of oppression. And she states many women of color, for example, are burdened by poverty, childcare responsibilities, and the lack of job skills, which has them depending on their abusive partners. So since the systems do not always recognize or think about the multi-layered oppressions, these women many times can be pushed aside or receive limited help. She also points out how intersectional subordination is frequently the consequence of the imposition of one burden that interacts with pre-existing vulnerabilities to create yet another dimension of disempowerment. So in other words, a woman who has no job skills, minimal education, and undocumented can end up depending on her abusive spouse, and therefore she has no power, no protection. So even if she reaches out for help against the abusive spouse, she might end up back in that abusive relationship because the system that is created, or the organizations that are created to try to help with the domestic violence, won't be able to have the resources or the funds to be able to help her with the other burdens, such as not having a job. Many shelters might not have the funds to help her or help with other burdens. And so that hurts that individual because since she doesn't have the job skills, she doesn't have the proper way of depending on herself, and she will have to end up back into that abusive relationship. And many women might not even have the ability to reach out for the available resources at all. And so this is just a cycle. And so what Kimberle Crenshaw is discussing and pointing out here is that if the systems and organizations recognized and mentally thought about the intersects that many abused women deal with, including such as in dealing with like not having a higher education, not having job skills, um, then they would be able to better help them and eliminate the marginalization of many abused women. Um, so, so one of the points that she discusses for political intersectionality is the anti-racism and rape. Anti-racist critics of rape law focus on how the law operates primarily to condemn rapes of white women by Black men, while heightened concern with protecting white women against Black men has been primarily criticized as a form of discrimination against Black men. Is it just as surely reflects the evaluation of Black women. This disregard for Black women results from an exclusive focus on the consequences of the problem for Black men. So in other words, what she's saying here is that even though it's good to have anti-racist laws and help individuals not be discriminated because of their race, that it shouldn't devalue a Black woman accusing a Black man of rape or sexual violence. And unfortunately, because of that, sometimes it can be dismissed or not even investigated because of that defense of racism, which devalues the Black woman's accusation. So this brings me into the example of the Anita Hill case. So if you're not familiar with Anita Hill, I would recommend watching this documentary, Anita Speaking Truth to Power. It is a great documentary and it really goes over everything. She is the pioneer for sexual harassment in the workplace. So in 1991, Anita Hill accused Supreme Court Justice nominee Clarence Thomas of sexually harassing her during the 2 years that they worked together in the 80s. Thomas denied all allegations and called the hearing a high-tech lynching. So since he was a Black man being accused by a Black woman, many were angry and only focused on racial issues instead of the issue of sexual harassment. So both the Senate and many, including other African Americans within the US, chose not to see a woman being sexually harassed, but they saw it as an attack on an African American, the first African American making it to the Supreme Court justice. And so, unfortunately, Anita Hill was treated unfairly, and her case was thrown out the window without any real further investigation, including not hearing all her witnesses or any other women even accusing Justice Thomas. And so, I'm not saying that a man who's accused of sexual harassment means he automatically did it. And I'm not even saying that Clarence Thomas is guilty or not guilty. That is besides the point. The whole point is that Anita Hill should have not been treated unfairly, and the case should not have been thrown out the window without any real investigation, solely because of the anti-racist issues of towards, like, in other words, the fact that he said that it was an attack on his race. If the Senate would have thought of and kept in mind the theoretical framework of intersectionality of Anita Hill, they would have taken in consideration that she is not just a Black woman, but she is a woman. She is a woman accusing a man of sexual harassment. She is a woman accusing her boss of sexual harassment. And if they would have kept that in mind, if they would have held on to that intersect, they would have given her the ability to really have a fair trial and truly investigate this accusation without it just being thrown out the window. And so even though it is good to have anti-racist laws, it should not come at the expense of a woman of color. So in other words, those laws should include the ability to help women of color accusing a black man of sexual violence in any way, shape, or form. They should keep that in mind as well. And also, if you watch, another thing that I wanted to point out, if you watch this documentary, you will notice the imbalance in the Senate, because it's mainly, at that time in 91, it was mainly white older males who did not comprehend her or her accusations, which also hurt her case and disempowered her. So she may not have won this case, but she, like I said, she was a pioneer for sexual harassment in the workplace. And she did influence and encourage a lot of women to go into politics because of that imbalance. So two certain images, I put in these two certain images because I thought they were a perfect representation of what I'm trying to explain within this video. So on the left side, we see how an individual has multiple forms of identity: education, sexuality, race, gender, language, class, and so on. And on the one on the right side, not only does it have an awesome quote by Kimberle Crenshaw, but this in this image shows how somebody created this cool graph of showing all the different identities that a person can have, such as race, class, but they used it with color. So as you can see, the colors blend together, and so the identities of a person obviously blend together, and it's hard to separate that once it's all blended together. Intersectionality. And so this quote by Kimberle Crenshaw says, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. So just as I was discussing that there are so many multiple forms of discrimination towards your identity, there's also multiple forms of privilege and power. So let's say a white man in the United States who speaks English and has a higher education has way more privilege and power than, let's say, an undocumented woman of color who doesn't speak English in the United States and has no education and no job skills. And so just as there is multiple forms of discrimination, there's also multiple forms of privilege and power. And so before I finish up, I found this quote, another quote by Kimberle Crenshaw, which I thought was perfect for this presentation of what I'm trying to explain here. So she says, the better we understand how identities and power work together from one context to another, the less likely our movements for change are to fracture. In other words, systems that are created, movements, organizations, if they were to keep in mind the idea of intersectionality and how there's so many multiple forms of oppression towards an individual, if they were to keep that in mind, so many individuals wouldn't be marginalized and so many issues wouldn't be marginalized. In other words, it would be a stronger system, a stronger organization or movement for individuals. And so for my closing thoughts, I just want to sum up that the theoretical framework of intersectionality helps focus the reality that every person has multiple identities, which can create multiple layers of oppression and discrimination or privilege, as I stated earlier. Even though there has been a lot of progression, there is still a lot of holes within the power structures, which affects and creates oppression against class, gender, race, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. And two main things that I would love for you to get out of this video is that Kimberle Crenshaw in her article proves again and again all the different ways how ignoring the intersectionality of people, specifically women of color, disempowers and hurts them. And also how the framework of intersectionality would have helped Anita Hill and other women like Anita Hill to have fair trials when accusing someone of sexual violence. So I'm just giving you a real quick works cited page here. And like I said, I would recommend you reading this article, Mapping the Margins by Kimberle Crenshaw. She really does a great job of dissecting intersectionality, and she shows all the different ways and forms of how ignoring intersectionality harms individuals. And of course, the documentary of Anita Speaking Truth to Power is also a great documentary to see how she became a pioneer for sexual harassment in the workplace. But anyways, thank you for watching this video. And if you have any questions or comments, you can always comment down below. I will try my hardest to, of course, to answer any questions. And I hope this video helped you understand intersectionality. Thank you.